He thought one signature would be enough to erase her, but he had no idea he was signing his own downfall. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Emma Lawson never looked like someone who could shake a courtroom at 37. She lived in a small apartment, just under 800 square feet, taught literature at a quiet public high school, and wore the same soft gray cardigan that most people barely noticed. She moved through life like a shadow, polite, composed, invisible, and that was exactly how she preferred it, the kind of woman people underestimated without even realizing it, the kind of woman powerful men dismissed in seconds. Judge Richard Pierce had built his career on control. His courtroom ran like clockwork, every word measured, every outcome predictable, and every person who stood before him eventually learned the same lesson: respect authority or be crushed by it. So, when Emma stood up at a town council meeting and calmly questioned one of his rulings, citing legal inconsistencies with unsettling precision, something shifted in him. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something colder, something sharper. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him. She simply laid out facts in a way that made the room quiet. And for the first time in years, Richard Pierce felt something he refused to name: embarrassment. The silence that followed her words lingered longer than it should have. People exchanged glances, whispers spread, and though no one said it out loud, the balance of power in that room had tilted just enough for him to notice, and that was something he could not allow. Emma went home that night thinking it was over, just another civic discussion, another small moment of standing up for what was right. She made tea, graded papers, and prepared for the next school day, unaware that somewhere across town a man with far more influence than she imagined was already rewriting her future in his office. Lined with polished wood and framed accolades, Judge Pierce reviewed her file with a slow, deliberate calm. A teacher, no criminal record, no legal representation, no connections, the perfect target. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, as a faint smile formed, not one of amusement, but of decision. He wasn't going to argue with her. He wasn't going to confront her. He was going to make an example out of her, because in his world, authority was never questioned without consequences. The paperwork was simple, almost routine: a modification here, a charge adjustment there, nothing obvious, nothing reckless, just enough to turn a minor issue into something far more serious, something that would pull her into his courtroom under his rules, where he controlled every variable, where truth could be shaped by presentation and perception. And by the time Emma received the notice, it would already be too late to step away. The next morning, sunlight filtered through her classroom windows as Emma wrote a quote on the board, her handwriting steady, her voice calm. As students settled into their seats, none of them knew that within hours their quiet teacher would be standing in a courtroom facing charges she never should have had to answer. None of them could see the trap that had already been set. Emma paused for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the chalk as if something in the air had shifted, but she brushed it off, turning back to her lesson, unaware that across the city a man in a black robe was already preparing to dismantle her life piece by piece. And in his mind it was already done. He believed she would walk into that courtroom small, uncertain, defeated, just another ordinary woman standing before power. He believed wrong. The notice arrived folded neatly inside a plain white envelope, as if it carried nothing more than routine paperwork. Emma Lawson stood in her kitchen that evening, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound as she read the words again and again: failure to appear, contempt of court, additional penalties pending. Her brow furrowed, not in panic, but in confusion. She had paid the original citation weeks ago. She remembered the confirmation email, the exact amount, the date, everything about it had been ordinary. And yet this document told a completely different story, one that placed her not as a compliant citizen, but as someone who had deliberately ignored the law. She set the paper down on the small wooden table and exhaled slowly. Something about this did not feel like a mistake. Across town, Judge Richard Pierce reviewed the same file, now thicker, heavier, adjusted precisely to support a narrative he had already decided would unfold. His clerk stood nearby, shifting uneasily as Pierce tapped the folder with quiet satisfaction. Everything had been arranged with careful restraint, nothing overt, nothing that would draw immediate scrutiny. Just enough to complicate the situation, to force Emma into a position where she would have to defend herself under pressure in his courtroom on his terms, and that was where he held absolute power. The next morning, Emma arrived at school earlier than usual. Her steps measured, her expression composed, but her mind already turning. She printed out her payment confirmation, reviewed the timestamps, cross-checked the details. Nothing was missing, nothing was unclear. And yet the charge remained as if the truth itself had been rewritten. During her lunch break, she sat alone at her desk, sunlight stretching across stacks of student essays. As she read through the court notice again, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. She had seen something like this before years ago in a lecture hall filled with law students where a professor once explained how systems could be bent, not broken, reshaped in subtle ways that few would question. She had understood it then as theory. Now she was seeing it as reality, and somewhere deep beneath her calm exterior something began to shift. Not panic, not anger, something steadier, something sharper. That afternoon a colleague approached her in the hallway, lowering her voice, as if the walls themselves were listening. "I heard about your situation. The superintendent mentioned it." Emma paused, offering a polite smile, though she noticed the subtle distance in the woman's tone, the quiet judgment already forming. "I am sure it is just a misunderstanding," she replied gently, but the words did not land the way they once might have. The seed of doubt had already been planted, and in places like this doubt spread quickly. By the time the final bell rang, Emma knew the situation had moved beyond a simple clerical error. This was no longer about a ticket. It was about something larger, something intentional. That evening she sat at her kitchen table again, the same soft light, the same quiet room. But this time the paper in front of her was not just a notice, it was a challenge. Her fingers traced the edges of the document as her mind worked through possibilities, scenarios, outcomes. She could hire a lawyer, she could attempt to resolve it quietly, she could step back and hope it disappeared, but each option felt incomplete, as if it addressed the surface while ignoring the structure beneath. Then her gaze settled on a single line in the notice. The presiding judge, Richard Pierce. The name lingered in the air between thought and realization, and suddenly the pieces aligned. The meeting, the silence, the look in his eyes. When she had spoken, not anger, not surprise, but calculation. Emma leaned back in her chair, the faintest shift in her posture barely visible yet unmistakable. Something inside her had moved from uncertainty to clarity. This was not an accident. This was a response. Across the city, Pierce prepared for the upcoming hearing, reviewing statements, rehearsing the tone he would use, calm, authoritative, unquestionable. He imagined her standing before him, uncertain, unprepared, just another individual overwhelmed by the weight of procedure. He had seen it countless times, the hesitation, the confusion, the quiet surrender before judgment was even spoken. But what he could not see, what he had not accounted for, was the quiet transformation happening miles away in a small apartment where a woman he believed to be ordinary was no longer thinking like a teacher. She was remembering how to think like something else entirely. And as the clock ticked closer to the hearing, one truth settled into place, unnoticed by everyone except her. She was not walking into his courtroom unprepared. She was walking in, fully aware that the game had already begun. The night before the hearing, Emma Lawson did not sleep. She did not pace. She did not panic. She sat at her small kitchen table with a stack of printed documents arranged in perfect order, her laptop open beside her, casting a soft glow across the room. Every detail had been reviewed, every timestamp cross-checked, every inconsistency noted with quiet precision. The same calm rhythm she used to grade essays now applied to something far more consequential. Her eyes moved steadily across legal statutes, her memory filling in gaps that years of silence had not erased, because long before she became a teacher, Emma had spent years immersed in law, not as a profession, but as a discipline she once mastered. And though she had walked away from that world, she had never truly forgotten how to navigate it. She remembered how arguments were constructed, how evidence could be framed, how authority could be challenged not through emotion, but through structure and logic. And as the hours passed, that knowledge returned, not all at once, but in layers, like a language she had not spoken in years, suddenly becoming clear again. Across town, Judge Richard Pierce prepared in a very different way, his office immaculate, his movements deliberate. He reviewed the case file not to question it, but to reinforce it in his mind. Everything was in place, the narrative consistent, the documentation aligned. He had built this scenario carefully enough that even if questions arose, they would appear minor, insignificant, easily dismissed within the weight of procedure. He had done this before, not often, but enough to know exactly how it would unfold. The defendant would hesitate, confusion would replace confidence, and by the time she attempted to respond, the outcome would already be sealed. His confidence was not loud, it did not need to be. It sat quietly beneath his authority, like a foundation he believed could not be shaken. Morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretching across the city. Emma stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the sleeve of her cardigan, her reflection unchanged, calm, composed, unremarkable. Yet her eyes held something new, not defiance, not fear, but focus. She picked up her folder, closed it gently, and stepped out into the cool air. The courthouse stood tall against the skyline, its marble steps worn by decades of footsteps, each one carrying stories of judgment and consequence. As Emma walked up those steps, she felt the weight of the place, not as intimidation, but as context. This was where narratives were accepted or dismantled, where perception often shaped truth, and where today she would be expected to play a role she had no intention of accepting. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool, the lighting bright, but impersonal. Rows of seats filled slowly, with people waiting for their own cases, each absorbed in quiet tension. The sound of papers shuffling, low conversations, and distant footsteps created a steady background hum. Emma took a seat near the front, placing her folder neatly on her lap. Her posture relaxed, her breathing. Even a few glances drifted her way, brief assessments that quickly moved on. She was exactly what she appeared to be to everyone except one person. When Judge Pierce entered the room, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Conversation stopped. Movement slowed, and all attention turned toward the bench. He took his seat with practiced authority, his expression neutral as his gaze moved across the room. And then it found her. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed through his eyes. Not recognition, not concern, simply confirmation. She was here, exactly where he expected her to be. The proceedings began, case after case, moving quickly, each one following the same predictable rhythm. Names called, charges stated, decisions made, and then finally her name, Emma Lawson. The room seemed to tighten around the sound as she stood and stepped forward, her movements steady, her expression unchanged. She took her place at the defendant's table, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence stretched thin before Pierce spoke, his voice calm, controlled, carrying the weight of his position. Miss Lawson, you are here today regarding charges of failure to appear and contempt of court. How do you intend to proceed? The question hung in the air. Simple on the surface, but layered with expectation. This was the moment where hesitation was supposed to appear, where uncertainty would begin to unravel her. But Emma did not hesitate. She did not look around. She did not shift her stance. She simply met his gaze and said with quiet clarity, "I will be representing myself." And for the first time that morning, something almost imperceptible shifted in the room, as if the script had just changed in a way no one had anticipated. The words settled into the courtroom like a ripple through still water. "I will be representing myself." There was no hesitation in Emma Lawson's voice, no tremor, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty. And for a brief moment no one spoke, not the clerk, not the observers, not even Judge Richard Pierce, whose fingers paused mid-movement above the file in front of him. It was not what he expected. Defendants like her did not choose this path. They sought guidance. They leaned on others. They did not step forward alone, especially not in his courtroom. Pierce recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into practiced neutrality, though a faint tightening around his eyes betrayed a shift. "Miss Lawson," he said carefully, "self-representation is a serious decision. The court strongly advises legal counsel." His tone carried a subtle weight, not quite concern, not quite warning, but something designed to re-establish control. Emma did not move. She did not glance down at her notes. She did not search for reassurance. She simply responded, "I understand, Your Honor." Her voice, even, measured, and final. And in that moment the option he had offered ceased to exist. The clerk adjusted her glasses, making a small notation, while a low murmur passed through the back rows, quickly suppressed by the quiet authority of the room. Pierce leaned back, slightly studying Emma more closely now, not as a passive participant, but as something less predictable, something that required recalibration. He opened the file, flipping through pages that had been meticulously prepared, each document aligned, each statement reinforcing the narrative he had constructed. The charges were clear: failure to appear, contempt of court, procedural violations that carried weight not because of their severity, but because of how easily they could be framed as disregard for authority. "Miss Lawson," Pierce continued, his voice steady, "you were issued a lawful summons and failed to comply. In addition, you have been cited for contempt due to non-appearance. How do you respond to these charges?" The question was direct, the structure familiar, designed to guide the defendant into a narrow path of explanation or apology, a path that would ultimately lead exactly where he intended. But Emma did not follow it. Instead, she reached for her folder, opening it with deliberate calm, and placed a single document on the table before her, her fingers resting lightly against the edge as she spoke. "I would like to begin by clarifying the timeline of events, Your Honor." Her choice of words subtle, but precise, not defensive, not reactive, but structured. Pierce's gaze sharpened slightly. Timeline was not the word most defendants chose. It implied sequence accuracy analysis. He allowed a brief nod. Proceed. Emma lifted the document, holding it just enough for the clerk to see, while keeping her eyes forward on the bench. On March 10th, at 3:14 in the afternoon, I submitted full payment. For the original citation, she stated clearly the exact time noted in the official transaction record. She slid the paper forward. The clerk took it, scanning quickly before passing it up to the bench. Pierce accepted it without comment, his expression unreadable, but his attention now fully engaged. Emma continued, her voice steady, each word placed with care. The notice I received indicates a failure to appear for a scheduled hearing. However, no such hearing was communicated to me prior to this notice. She paused just long enough for the statement to settle, not rushed, not drawn out, simply allowing the absence of information to become visible in the space between words. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible, a subtle shift in attention as listeners began to lean in, not because of drama, but because of clarity. Pierce glanced down at the document, then back at Emma. His response measured the court records indicate that proper notification was issued. His tone remained controlled, but there was a slight adjustment, now a fraction slower than before. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Then I would respectfully request that the court provide documentation of that notification, including date, time, and method of delivery. She said, her voice unchanged, but the direction of the conversation unmistakably altered. This was no longer a simple response. It was a request for evidence, and in that request the structure of the proceedings shifted ever so slightly. The clerk hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing quickly, searching the system. Pierce's gaze remained fixed on Emma, now not dismissive, not confident, but focused, as if reassessing a calculation he had already completed. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of authority, something unfamiliar began to take shape, not doubt, not yet, but awareness that the person standing before him was no longer following the path he had prepared for her, and the room felt it, even if no one could name it. The quiet sense that something had just changed, and that whatever came next would not unfold the way anyone expected. The clerk's fingers moved faster, now the quiet clicking of keys echoing louder than it should have in a room that had suddenly become too still. Her eyes scanned the screen once, then again, as if expecting the information to appear on a second look, but it did not. Her posture shifted slightly, shoulders tightening just enough to be noticed by those paying attention. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice careful, almost hesitant. Your Honor, I am unable to locate any record of notification being issued for the alleged hearing. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. A ripple passed through the courtroom, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. The kind of shift that happens when something expected fails to appear. Judge Richard Pierce did not react right away. His expression remained composed, his gaze steady on the screen in front of him. But the pause lingered, just a fraction, too long a fraction, that Emma Lawson did not miss, nor did the few observers who had begun to sense that this was no longer routine. Pierce cleared his throat, subtly adjusting the file in front of him. The court maintains extensive records, he said, his tone measured, though slightly firmer than before. It is possible the documentation has not yet been fully retrieved. His words were precise, controlled, but they lacked the effortless certainty he had carried earlier. Emma did not interrupt. She allowed the statement to settle into the space between them, then responded with the same calm clarity. Your Honor, if no notification can be verified, then the basis for a failure to appear would be procedurally unsupported. Her voice did not rise. She did not press. She simply stated what was already becoming evident, and in doing so she shifted the burden without force, without confrontation. The room seemed to lean in collectively, the silence no longer passive, but attentive. Pierce's fingers tapped lightly against the desk, once a small controlled motion that betrayed the first sign of recalculation. He glanced toward the clerk, then back at the screen, then finally at Emma, and for the first time his gaze carried something new. Not dismissal, not authority, but evaluation. He was no longer dealing with a passive defendant. He was facing someone who understood the structure he relied on and was beginning to move within it with deliberate precision. The clerk spoke again, this time more cautiously. I can expand the search parameters, Your Honor, perhaps check archived entries or external notices. Pierce gave a brief nod. Do that. His voice quieter, now less performative, more focused. As the clerk worked, Emma remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture Unchanged, but her presence now impossible to ignore. A few seats back, a man who had been waiting for his own case leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the exchange, as if witnessing something he could not quite explain. This was not drama. It was something quieter, something more unsettling. The slow unraveling of certainty. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. The sound of keys, the faint hum of the courtroom system, the steady rhythm of breath, all blending into a single, suspended moment. Then the clerk stopped, her hands hovering before she looked up, her expression no longer uncertain, but clear. Your Honor, I have reviewed all available records. There is no documentation of any notification being issued to Miss Lawson prior to this notice. This time the silence did not ripple. It settled heavy, complete. Pierce did not speak immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen as if searching for something that was no longer there. The foundation he had constructed so carefully now showing the first visible fracture, not enough to collapse, not yet, but enough to demand attention. He straightened slightly, his voice returning, though its tone had shifted. Miss Lawson, he said slowly, even if the notification cannot be immediately verified, the court may still proceed based on the existing record. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. Then I would respectfully request that the court clarify how an individual can be held in violation of a proceeding that was never communicated. Her words were not aggressive, they were not emotional, they were precise, and in their precision, they carried weight, the kind that does not need volume to be felt. Pierce opened his mouth to respond, but for a brief second no words came. His expression remained controlled, but something behind it faltered just enough to be seen. And in that moment the room understood what he had not yet admitted. The script had not only changed, it was no longer his to control, and as the quiet settled once more, one truth began to take shape, undeniable and irreversible. This was no longer a case being managed, it was a position being challenged, and the person he had expected to dismantle was now the one carefully pulling at the threads he had believed were untouchable. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt heavy, as if the room itself was waiting for something to break. Judge Richard Pierce shifted slightly in his seat, his hand moving toward the edge of the bench in a controlled motion that betrayed more than he intended. He had spent years mastering the rhythm of authority, the ability to guide outcomes without resistance. But this was different. The structure he relied on was no longer holding as firmly as it should have, and the woman standing before him was not reacting the way she was supposed to. Emma Lawson remained still, her presence calm, almost unremarkable to anyone who had not been paying attention from the beginning. But now every eye in the room was on her, not because she demanded it, but because she had quietly taken control of something no one realized could shift. The clerk adjusted her posture, glancing between the screen and the judge as if waiting for direction, but none came immediately. Pierce's voice, when it returned, was measured, but noticeably slower. Miss Lawson, the court acknowledges the absence of immediate documentation. However, procedural matters can involve delays and discrepancies. His words were carefully chosen, attempting to reframe the situation without conceding ground. Emma listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, then responded with the same quiet precision. Your Honor, I understand that systems can experience delays, but procedural enforcement requires verifiable foundation. Without that foundation, the enforcement itself becomes questionable. She did not raise her voice. She did not challenge him directly, yet the meaning was clear and undeniable. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. One man leaned back, exhaling softly, as if realizing he was witnessing something unusual. Pierce's gaze narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. He was no longer presenting authority, he was managing a developing situation, and that distinction mattered. He tapped the file once, then closed it slowly, a subtle shift signaling that the path he had prepared was no longer sufficient. Miss Lawson, he said, your argument suggests that the charge lacks procedural validity. Is that your position? Emma inclined her head slightly. Yes, Your Honor, based on the absence of verified notification and the confirmed payment of the original citation, there is no procedural basis for failure to appear. She paused just long enough for the statement to settle, then added, I would also like to note that the notice I received introduces additional penalties that were not part of the original citation, nor supported by any documented proceeding. The words landed with precision, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible. The air itself seemed to tighten around the exchange. The clerk typed quickly, her screen reflecting the same absence. Emma had already exposed. Pierce's fingers pressed together briefly, then released a small, controlled gesture, but one that carried weight. He turned slightly toward the clerk, retrieved the full record, including any amendments or adjustments. His voice was firm, but no longer effortless. The clerk nodded immediately, her movements sharper, now more urgent. Emma watched without expression, but her eyes tracked every detail, every shift, every hesitation, because this was no longer about defending herself, it was about revealing the structure beneath the accusation. Minutes passed. Again, though they felt stretched thin, each second amplifying the tension, the clerk finally spoke, her voice steady, but quieter than before. Your Honor, there are no recorded amendments to the original citation and no authorized escalation of penalties prior to the issuance of this notice. The statement did not echo, it settled. And in that settling, something fundamental shifted. Pierce did not look at Emma right away, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him, as if recalculating something that no longer aligned with expectation. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, not weaker, but more controlled, more deliberate. Miss Lawson, he said, the court will need to review these discrepancies before proceeding further. Emma responded with a slight nod. Of course, Your Honor. And then she waited, not impatient, not expectant, simply present, the kind of presence that does not push, but does not yield either. The room held its breath in a way that no one acknowledged, because what had begun as a routine proceeding had transformed into something else, something quieter, but far more significant. The authority that once filled the space completely was no longer absolute. It had been questioned, not loudly, not aggressively, but precisely, and in that precision it had begun to fracture. And as Judge Richard Pierce sat there reviewing a case that no longer behaved the way he intended, one truth became impossible: to ignore the woman he had chosen as an example was now becoming something else entirely, not a defendant, not a mistake, but a variable he could no longer control. Judge Richard Pierce had built his entire career on one unshakable belief that once a narrative entered his courtroom, it belonged to him. But now, as he sat behind the bench reviewing a case that refused to follow his design, he felt something he had not experienced in years: not fear, not yet, but resistance, the kind that does not come from noise or defiance, but from precision. Emma Lawson stood quietly across from him, her hands resting lightly against the table, her posture relaxed, but her presence now undeniable. She was no longer reacting, she was guiding, and the difference was subtle but absolute. Pierce closed the file again, this time with more intention, his voice steady, but stripped of its earlier certainty. Miss Lawson, the court acknowledges the discrepancies presented. However, the absence of documentation does not immediately invalidate procedural authority. The statement was an attempt to reclaim ground, to re-establish the framework he controlled. But Emma did not move, she did not argue. She simply responded, then, I would respectfully ask the court to clarify the origin of the additional charges and penalties introduced in the notice. She set her tone, even her words deliberate, each one placed with care. She reached into her folder and withdrew another document, placing it gently on the table. This notice reflects an escalation beyond the original citation, yet no corresponding record exists to support that escalation. She paused, allowing the silence to absorb the implication before continuing. Without verification of origin or authorization, these additions cannot be considered procedurally sound. The room went completely still this time, not with curiosity, but with awareness. Something was unraveling, not dramatically, not loudly, but with quiet inevitability. The clerk's hands hovered above the keyboard. Again, her eyes moving between screens, as if searching for something that should have been there, but was not. Pierce's gaze fixed on the document. Emma had presented, his expression controlled, but no longer effortless, because this question was different. It did not challenge the surface of the case, it reached beneath it to the point where the structure itself had been altered, and for the first time, he could not immediately redirect it. Retrieve the source entry for the notice, he said finally, his voice lower, more focused. The clerk nodded quickly, her movements sharper, now driven by urgency rather than routine. Seconds passed, then minutes, the quiet stretching further than before, each moment amplifying the absence they were all beginning to feel. Emma remained still, her breathing, even her eyes steady, not on the clerk, not on the gallery, but on the judge, because she already knew what they were looking for was not there, and she was not waiting for discovery, she was waiting for acknowledgement. The clerk stopped typing, her shoulders stiffening slightly before she spoke. Your Honor, there is no originating entry for the amended notice, no authorization record, no adjustment log. The statement did not echo, it settled. And in that settling, the courtroom shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Pierce did not respond immediately. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the bench, then released a small, controlled motion, but one that no longer carried dominance. It carried calculation, because now the question was no longer about the defendant, it was about the record itself. Miss Lawson, he said slowly, the court will need to examine how this discrepancy occurred. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement, but not stepping back. Then, I would also ask the court to consider the implications of that discrepancy, she replied, her voice calm, but unmistakably firm. If the record has been altered without proper authorization, then the issue extends beyond this case. It becomes a matter of procedural integrity. The words landed with precision, each one expanding the scope of the situation beyond what Pierce had intended. This was no longer contained. It was no longer manageable within the narrow boundaries he had created. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery, quickly suppressed, but impossible to ignore. The clerk sat frozen for a brief moment, her eyes fixed on the screen, as if hoping for something to appear and restore order, but nothing changed. Pierce looked at Emma, then truly looked at her, not as a defendant, not as a variable, but as someone who understood exactly what she was doing. And in that moment, the realization settled deeper than any argument she had made. He had not brought her into his courtroom to control the narrative. He had brought her into a space where the truth could not be shaped the way he expected. And as the silence returned heavier than before, one truth became unavoidable. The case was no longer about whether she would stand or fall. It was about whether the system itself could withstand what she had just revealed. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of routine judgment. It felt like a space suspended between two realities, one that had existed before Emma Lawson spoke, and one that was forming with every word she placed into the silence. Judge Richard Pierce sat still for a moment, longer than anyone expected, his gaze fixed on the documents before him, but no longer seeing them as tools of control. Instead, they had become something else, something fragile, something that no longer aligned with the certainty he had relied on for years. He finally looked up, his expression composed, but the effort behind it now visible. Miss Lawson, he said slowly, the court acknowledges the seriousness of your observations and will take them under consideration. The words were careful, measured, designed to regain a sense of authority, but they carried none of the quiet dominance they once held. Emma did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to settle into the room, just as she had done before. Then, she spoke with the same calm precision. Your Honor, I appreciate the court's consideration. However, I would like to clarify that this is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record. Her voice did not rise, but the distinction she drew was unmistakable. Interpretation could be debated, record could not be ignored. She reached once more into her folder and withdrew a final set of documents, placing them gently on the table, her movements unhurried but intentional. I conducted an independent review of the notice issued to me, she continued, her tone steady, and in doing so, I identified metadata associated with the document, including the timestamp of its creation and the user credentials linked to its authorization. The clerk's head lifted slightly, her attention shifting instantly. Pierce's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as Emma slid the document forward. This information indicates that the amended notice was generated after the original citation had been resolved, and that it was not processed through the standard system protocol. The room went completely still, no shifting, no murmuring, just a silence that felt heavier than anything before, because now this was no longer about absence, it was about presence. Something had been created, something had been inserted, and the question was no longer whether there was an error, but who had made it. Pierce's hand moved toward the document, stopping just short for a fraction of a second before he picked it up, his eyes scanning the details, his expression unchanged, but the stillness in his posture now absolute. Emma continued, her voice unwavering, I would also note that the user credentials associated with this entry are restricted to judicial authorization level access. The words landed with precision, each one narrowing the space around the truth until there was nowhere left for it to shift. The clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard, her eyes moving between the screen and the judge, as if waiting for something that would restore the structure of the moment. But nothing came. Pierce placed the document back on the bench with deliberate care, his gaze fixed forward, his voice, when it returned, quieter than before, but carrying a different kind of weight. Miss Lawson, he said, the court will need to address this matter with appropriate procedural review. Emma inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement, but not stepping back. Then I respectfully request that all charges against me be dismissed pending that review, she replied, her tone calm, but final, because this was no longer a request born of defense, it was a conclusion supported by the very system that had been used against her. The room held its breath again, not in anticipation, but in recognition of what was unfolding. Pierce's fingers pressed together briefly, then released his gaze, shifting once more to the document, then back to Emma. And for the first time, since she had entered the courtroom, there was no calculation left in his eyes, no quiet confidence, no controlled narrative. There was only the undeniable awareness that the position he had constructed had been dismantled piece by piece. Not through force, not through defiance, but through clarity, and in that clarity something irreversible had occurred. The authority he had wielded so effortlessly had been placed under the same scrutiny he had once reserved for others. And as the silence settled once more, one truth stood clear above everything else. This was no longer a case that could be managed. It was a moment that could not be undone. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened, as if the entire courtroom understood that whatever came next would not simply conclude a case, it would define it. Judge Richard Pierce remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed ahead, no longer searching for control, but acknowledging the absence of it. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but stripped of the quiet authority that once filled every word. Miss Lawson, based on the information presented and the discrepancies identified, the court finds that the charges against you cannot be sustained. He paused briefly, the words settling into the room before continuing. All charges are hereby dismissed. The statement did not echo, it landed final, complete, and for a brief second no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the room itself needed time to adjust to a reality it had not anticipated. Emma Lawson did not react immediately. She did not smile. She did not exhale in relief. She simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome had already been understood long before it was spoken. She gave a slight nod, Your Honor, her voice soft but clear, and then she gathered her documents, placing them neatly back into her folder with the same care she had shown from the beginning. Because for her this was never about victory, it was about alignment, the truth placed exactly where it belonged. Across the room, a quiet murmur finally began to rise, low voices exchanging glances, subtle shifts of recognition passing between strangers who had just witnessed something they could not fully articulate. The clerk sat motionless for a moment longer before lowering her eyes to the desk, her fingers resting still against the keyboard, as if uncertain how to proceed now that the structure she relied on had been interrupted. Pierce remained seated, his hands resting against the bench, his expression composed, but distant, not defeated, not exposed, but changed in a way that could not be reversed, because what had unfolded was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was precise, and in that precision it had reached deeper than any argument ever could. Emma turned and began to walk toward the exit. Her steps measured the soft sound of her shoes against the floor, echoing gently through the room. And as she moved past the rows of observers, something shifted in the way they looked at her, no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but aware, because they had seen what quiet strength could do when it was allowed to speak without interruption. When she reached the door, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning, not looking back, just allowing the moment to settle completely before stepping out into the hallway, where the noise of the outside world returned in contrast to the stillness she left behind inside the courtroom. Proceedings resumed, eventually another name called, another case brought forward, but the rhythm had changed. Something intangible but undeniable lingered in the air, a subtle awareness that authority was not absolute, that it could be questioned not through force, but through clarity. And as Judge Richard Pierce called the next case, his voice steady once again, there was a difference, not in tone, not in volume, but in something beneath it, a recognition that control was not guaranteed, that every narrative carried the possibility of being seen for what it truly was. And as the day continued and the courtroom returned to its familiar routine, one truth remained quietly embedded in the memory of everyone who had been present that morning and that day. Without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Emma Lawson had shown exactly what dignity looks like.